Welcome to this virtual roundtable on identity research in Asia. My name's Tim Bunnell. I'm currently director of the Asia Research Institute, or ARI, that has organized and is hosting this event. ARI was established at the National University of Singapore in 2001. One of the ways in which we're marking the 20th anniversary this year is by holding a series of virtual roundtables. Today is in fact the first anniversary roundtable in the series. And so my thanks to Jamie Davidson, the Identities Cluster research leader, and also to Tae-Ming Hua and Sharon Ong from ARI's events team for organizing it. I'm of course also extremely grateful to our three distinguished speakers for agreeing to participate in the virtual roundtable. This is a great lineup, so thank you very much, all three of you. One of the few things that hasn't changed since we started to devise anniversary plans back in pre-pandemic times, if we can remember those, is an intention to look towards the future. Anniversaries are, of course, occasions to look back and to reflect on past accomplishments, but we also see ARI20 as a chance to deliberate new research opportunities and emergent scholarly and political questions that ARI might tackle in the future. In this case, today, around issues of identity. And so the final thing I have to say is that I hope that at least some of you tuning in from around the world, and it's great to see so many of you, by the way, but I hope that some of you will continue to engage with ARI during the Institute's next 2 decades. So thank you once again, everyone, and I'll hand over now to Jamie. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. I am the moderator, Jamie Davidson. I am the new cluster leader of the Identities Cluster at Asia Research Institute. And I've also been a member of the Political Science Department in US for over 15 years. Now, before I introduced our esteemed panelists and the format for today's event, I'd just like to say a couple of words, kind of introduce a little bit the work of the Identities Cluster itself. The Identities Cluster is principally devoted to advancing conceptual, theoretical, and methodological approaches to identities in Asia, including national, ethnic, religious, racial, sexual, gender, political, generational, and others. The cluster is multidisciplinary in scope and is concerned with how identities are produced, where they come from, how they are reproduced and maintained, the processes and mechanisms by which they change or evolve over time and space, and what kinds of effects they produce. And I'm assuming that we will hear from our speakers today, in fact, how some of their own work actually incorporates itself to the work of the cluster. So with that, I'd like to introduce one by one our speakers. I start with Srirupa Roy, who's a professor and chair of State and Democracy Center for Modern Indian Studies at the University of Göttingen in Germany. Oh, good morning. Prof. Roy's research interests are on nationalism and state formation, democratic theory, identity institutions, comparative inter-Asian studies, media and populist politics, and visual politics as well. Among others, she has served on the International Advisory Board of the Asia Research Institute since 2011, and her latest book is entitled Saffron Republic, Hindu Nationalism and State Power in India. Next, we have Peter Jackson, who is an emeritus professor in the College of Asia and the Pacific Schools of Culture, History, and Language at the Australian National University. Professor Jackson has written extensively on modern Thai cultural history with special interest in religion, sexuality, and critical theoretical approaches. He has presented at past ARI seminars and contributed a paper to the ARI Working Paper Series. One of his current book projects includes Deities and Divas, Queer Ritual Specialists in Thailand and Burma. And last but not least, we have Ian Ong, a professor of cultural studies at Western Sydney University. She was also the founding director of the Institute for Culture and Society and was named her university's very first distinguished professor. Several of her books have been translated into many languages. Her most recent book is Chinatown Unbound, Trans-Asian Urbanism in the Age of China. Lastly, she has also presented keynote addresses and papers in past RE workshops and symposiums. And before we begin, I'd like to briefly just go over today's format so everybody's clear how this is going to unfold. First, each speaker will offer for 15 minutes their thoughts on their own personal and professional histories and identities as they relate to the body of identities research in their respective fields, with two guiding questions in mind. First, how has the professional demands and practice on the one hand and personal experience on the other intersected, and how has it changed over time? And second, what are the causes for these changes over time? Have the changes been a good thing or a bad thing? So with that, I'd like to cede the floor to Professor Roy.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity to think through my research journey in the company of such pioneering scholars. Okay, so just let me begin with talking about academic frames. So over the 3 decades since the early 90s, when I first became interested in questions of nationalism and national identity, I think there's been a pretty substantial shift in the academic frames that orient the study of nationalism. So in the early 90s, nationalism research, especially if you focused on countries like India, as I did, was heavily influenced by the intellectual currents of Orientalism, subaltern studies, and post-colonial theory, and in the social sciences by instrumentalist and social constructivist approaches. Benedict Anderson's work from the early 80s on nationalism as the formation of imagined community. In the Indian context, Partha Chatterjee's work on the derivative discourse of Indian nationalism were other big influences. And all of this, I think, produced two main research emphases: politics of popular mobilization and public passions. And the second kind of theme was the kind of prominence of concepts like resistance, alterity, and difference, and the West, non-West fault line. And this featured quite prominently in nationalism scholarship, especially if your focus was on India or some other third world or developing country, and the term global south wasn't that common at the time. So in other words, post-colonial nationalisms in this moment of the kind of early 90s were usually studied as examples of a resistance or an insurgent politics. And writing back, writing against, provincializing Euro-American theory were all embraced as central tasks by many scholars of nationalism. Today, 3 decades later, academic frames have shifted, and the move, of course, from third world to global south terminology is only one aspect of this. For one, I think the focus on the resistance politics of post-colonial nationalism and the investments of hope, imagination, and community in nationalism has been upstaged by critical discussions of nationalist domination and exclusion, attention to the internal fractures and inequalities that post-colonial nationhood fosters, rather than the West non-West divide. So for instance, in the Indian case, the empirical reference of nationalism and national identity are no longer movements of national liberation, whether the anti-colonial movements, anti-colonial nationalism, or the subnational autonomy movements of the late 20th century that populated discussions, you know, in the 90s. Instead, I think most studies of contemporary Indian nationalism look at questions like how a dominant Hindu majoritarian identity is being sanctioned and crafted by the Indian state. So this also means that there's been a shift from that earlier movement paradigm of nationalism research to a governmental and institutional paradigm. supplementing older engagements with the passionate popular mobilizations of nationalist movements, the investments of state power in nationhood projects and the statist scaffolding of nationalism, even at this time of embracing market freedom and neoliberal order, are now also in focus. And finally, in terms of, kind of mapping and thinking about the changes, I think the West, non-West binary looms less large in discussions of the post-colony today. I think other sets of regional and conceptual orientations have come to the fore, and scholars are interested in historical connections, trans-regional geographies, and conceptual comparisons that do not relate and juxtapose India. The burden of proving and demonstrating post-colonial difference and alterity is not the only one that we bear today. And let me add here that this is not just about an individual analytical choice. A few years ago, while conducting fieldwork on the rise of an anti-corruption party in Delhi, I found that most of the party workers that I interviewed were referencing Singapore and Dubai rather than New York and London as models of national utopia. So comparative engagements, in other words, these comparative engagements beyond the West, non-West binary are lived emic practices. They're categories of analysis that are, I think, fundamentally categories of practice. Let me kind of situate myself and my personal and professional research journey in this canvas and talk a little bit about how my journey has, I think, influenced and shaped my research. So, I've worked on several different topics over the years: official nationalism and the making of a post-colonial national identity in India in the 50s and 60s, Indian media and middle-class politics in the 90s and 2000s, the comparative politics of secularism and religious nationalism in India and Turkey, the rise of authoritarian populism across Asia, and most recently, the resurgence of right-wing civilizational discourses and their affinities with certain versions of post-colonial and decolonial theory. And these are all quite distinct topics, but in my mind, at least, they're tied together by two common themes. The first is the kind of focus on identity beyond the lens of individual belief and beyond the work of persuasion. Now, of course, there's a rich body of work on identity's psychic contours, but I've always been more interested in identity and ideology's institutional ground. The role, for instance, of repetition, material encounters, and the pervasiveness more than the persuasiveness of nationalist symbols, ideas, idioms, and motifs in public space. How national identity markers suffuse everyday worlds and define the bounds of the permissible and kind of map the arc of the possible. So that's kind of one common theme, this idea of identity beyond the lens of beyond belief. Another common theme that I've kind of I think constantly kept coming back to, and this also relates to the institutional question, is the close and enabling relationship between so-called normal and deviant expressions of national identity, between governmental and movement forms of nationalism and democratic politics. And I keep circling back to this question. For instance, asking about what the relationship is between Hindu nationalist mobilizations and the politics of official Nehruvian nationalism, asking about how we can contextualize the rise of authoritarian populisms in India and other parts of the world within democratic political cultures. What really is the relationship between norm and exception? How useful is an exception framework, a deviation framework for understanding things like illiberal authoritarian populisms? How far can we go with that? And I think, at least in my mind, these research themes reflect very specific aspects of my personal and professional trajectory, and I'll just talk briefly about that here. I think I'm doing okay for time. Okay, so the first kind of thing that I think has been very formative for me are the kind of dislocations of my academic journey. my academic journey has taken me from India to the US, to Germany, and now also India, again, in a long distance commuting kind of way. So basically, I grew up in the planned economy India of the 70s and 80s. I then moved to the United States for my undergraduate education and for grad school. I worked there as a political science faculty member at an American public university for over a decade. And then in 2011, I moved to Germany to an interdisciplinary center of modern Indian studies where I am today. I now wear an administrative hat as well, and I also co-direct a German Institute of Advanced Studies based in Delhi. I would have been in Delhi at this moment, but of course, pandemic travel restrictions mean I'm doing that while sitting here in Göttingen. So for me, it's been a journey across 3 continents and 2 disciplinary fields. I've gone from US political science to European area studies, which is actually quite different from American area studies formations. And I've also gone from a very conventional academic career path today that also involves a fair amount of public facing and diplomacy work of communication between German and Indian government and academic constituencies. And, these shifts have really been enormously formative for me. And I mean this not just in the kind of trite sense of how all personal challenges are learning experiences. Instead, I think the disorientation and defamiliarization of this kind of zigzag has been conceptually productive and has allowed me to approach my area of study, late modern India, constantly in new ways. Moving across these different national communities of research transformed many taken for granted axioms into research puzzles that required explanation. The idea, for instance, of Indian exceptionalism is hard to sustain when India looks so different from the US, German, and Indian academies. And along with this experience of inhabiting different national research academies that turned the subject of my research, India, into a moving target, there have been several kind of random coincidences and personal choices about life and friendship that have allowed me to study India in the company of scholars who work on countries and world regions that are not usually paired with India: Turkey, Lebanon, Egypt, Brazil. And the strangeness and the difficulty of these conversations, the ways that they have always brought me back to the drawing board and got me to question my basic assumptions, have been very useful. I've been able to engage in a sense, in a comparative study of a single region or a single country, and to keep returning to my area and my field with new lenses and new questions. And, in thinking about all of this, I think Benedict Anderson's metaphor of the inverted telescope and the specter of comparisons, I think is quite apt for the kind of research methods that have kind of emerged out of my specific academic journey. And, this kind of focus on the relationship between norm and exception, troubling the distinction between good Indian secularism and bad Hindu nationalism, are all insights that have come from having to explain and communicate to different sets of strangers and friends. So that's kind of one, dislocations have been, I think, very important for me. And the second, and it sounds strange to say this, I think the second thing I've benefited from is delays and slow research. And my research career has meandered with many diversions and delays along the way, and I actually think that it's been a good thing. I'm currently finishing a book on the transformations of Indian democracy in the late 70s, and how this democratic golden age, this kind of celebrated moment, in fact set the context and groundwork for the rise of counter-democratic strongman politics today in the 21st century. Now, this book began too many years ago as an inquiry into Indian identity projects in the age of economic liberalization in the 2000s and beyond. But then life happened. There were many interruptions, from relocating across continents to a country I had never visited before, whose language I didn't know, to having and growing up a child. My research could only proceed in fits and starts, in little pieces picked up in between. And eventually the shapeless beast that has emerged from this kind of start and stop bits and pieces research practice, I think, has ended up asking and answering a very different question to what I had originally set out with. Because I found that when I put all these pieces together, my project was no longer about post-reform Indian identity in the 21st century. In fact, instead I was working towards, I was working back actually to a different moment, the 1970s, going from the identity politics of economic reform to the earlier and broader idea of reform and change itself. So how and why did democracy itself come to be seen as an object of reform, as something that was broken and needed fixing? And how did these visions of democratic repair from the 1970s rework and reimagine the terrain of Indianness? And what's the crooked line that leads from then to now? And I think the slowness and detours of my research journey have led me to these questions. And I think these are better and more relevant questions. Now, of course, I recognize that slow research, like slow food, is a privilege and a luxury, and I'm definitely fortunate to be able to keep picking away at my project like this. But, I think this model of slow diversion and delay research actually may well be the only realistic model of post-pandemic academic work that's available to us today, regardless of where we are located or how senior or junior we may be. And I think this is actually analytically beneficial. It's not just a pragmatic option that we need to settle for. When life gets in the way and we can meander from the straight and narrow of academic research, through conversations and collaborations with people outside the academy, all kinds of new possibilities open up. And for me, it's because life has got in the way, it's because of friendships and solidarities beyond the academy that I've been able to research and write about the politics of identity in any kind of legible way. I've spent the last several years collaborating on projects that don't belong to strictly academic spaces. So working with journalists to create a digital archive of oral histories of the Indian emergency. I've worked with filmmakers on a collaborative visual documentation project on new political movements, and with student and faculty activists in India on creating a digital archive of campus uprisings and the new narratives of nationhood that are emerging from Indian student movements today. And I think that especially for those of us interested in broad questions of identity, this is a productive way forward, and that it's when we form and sustain collaborations and solidarities and learn from others outside our usual academic comfort zones that knowledge work can really flourish. I've gone over time by a couple of minutes. Thanks for bearing with me.
That's fine. Thank you very much, Prof. Roy. I'd like to give the floor now to Prof. Jackson.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation today, and to have something a lot more of a personal engagement with the issue. I'd like to start, I suppose, with the most problematic aspect of identity for me, for my academic career, has always been the question, what are you? Are you a philosopher? Are you a historian? Are you an anthropologist? Are you gender studies? And after 40 years, I still don't know how to answer that question, even though I continually to be asked it. And towards the end, I think I want to try to come back to the fact that it still remains a problem for me to try to answer this sort of question, because the type of performance indicators, the type of neoliberal audit culture, which is monitoring and trying to put numbers to performance of the academy globally, I think that this is putting more pressure to try to redefine, to rediscipline academic boundaries, to put people into categories. What discipline is your research? What field are you in? So that this can be measured by governments, by academic monitors, etc. So I think I want to try to link these issues of this personal question about what are you academically, and this more institutional issue of the reformation, the reinstitutionalization of boundaries between disciplines in a neoliberal environment, by trying to give a more personal biography, which I want to thank the Professor Bunnell and Professor Davidson for giving us this sort of opportunity. And I hope you don't mind if I just do a bit of a 40-year history of how I got from A to B. Well, A was an undergraduate at the University of Sydney in philosophy, in a radical philosophy department. And this is in the middle of the 1970s. And I had two major final essays. One was on Lacanian psychoanalysis and theories of sexuality. Another one was engaging Foucault and theories of epistemological relativism, how forms of knowledge, forms of discourse are restricted or framed within forms of power, etc. Both of these themes really fascinated me. But in the 1970s in Australia, with male homosexuality still being illegal, and it's still illegal in Singapore today in 2021, I really didn't see any opportunity to do sexuality studies as any future, any postgraduate studies. So I wanted to take forward the issue in terms of postgraduate studies of relativism. To what extent are forms of knowledge framed within the cultural context within which they emerge? And having had a limited background in the suburbs of Sydney growing up, but having been, in a sense, politicized in the anti-Vietnam War movement, in the beginnings of the feminist movement in Australia at that time, a couple of issues sort of framed me in how to try to begin to approach this issue of what are the cultural frames of forms of knowledge that Foucault was alerting us to in his early research. And a couple of ideas that really struck me about this. One was, as being a politicized Australian in the 1970s, I was an anti-imperialist, reacting against the history of British colonialism, reacting against American neo-colonialism in Southeast Asia, against the Vietnam War. I really felt that at that point politically, it really wasn't feasible to see either Europe, Britain, or North America as any place to search for answers, given their histories of colonialism, neo-colonialism. The answer had to be sought somewhere else. Positioned in Australia at the other end of the world, on the edge of Asia, on the western side of the Pacific, it seemed to me that the Australian Academy in the 1970s still hadn't come to terms with the fact of where Australia was in the world. For most of my colleagues and for most of my lecturers in the 1970s, Asia was simply this unfortunately large expanse of land that separated Australia from the rest of the world. And you had to fly over for 24 hours before you could reach the real place, which was London, or in the other direction, 20 hours to reach New York. And it seemed to me that this was a totally unfeasible way to structure an academy. So that thinking about through where would I go academically in my postgraduate research, I thought that the only real way was begin to engage these issues of forms of knowledge by getting outside the West, resisting this colonial history of the place of Australia, and actually engage the place that was next door, being Asia. So like many of my colleagues, many of other people in their 20s at that time, I did the backpacking trip through Southeast Asia into Bangladesh and India. And coming back to what frames intellectual histories, I think serendipity is a really important part of that. Before I went on this trip in the early 1980s, I had no interest at all in Thailand, no particular idea in Buddhism at all. But it was simply that first visit to Southeast Asia, with the questions that I just framed you earlier on emerging from undergraduate studies, that led me to see the possibility of doing research on this place, on Buddhism in Thailand, about Thailand, that may be able to provide a frame to do these sorts of issues further along in the line. I came back to Australia, and talking about disciplines, the fact that I had a BA, an honours BA in philosophy, really meant that I was restricted in what I could do next. But thinking about Buddhism, the ambiguous place of Buddhism in the Western Academy, historically, is Buddhism a religion? Is it a philosophy? These sorts of Buddhism has been studied the last 2 centuries in the Western Academy, both in religious studies and also under philosophy. In a sense, I was moved to do Buddhist philosophy because my undergraduate major had been in that field. So I found myself being able to inveigle myself into a PhD on Thai Buddhist philosophy at the Australian National University, which was the only place in Australia that taught Thai at that time. So I moved from Sydney to Canberra to learn Thai and to begin a PhD on Thai Buddhist philosophy. I was able to spend more than a year in Thailand during my PhD, both learning more about the language, doing research, going to classes, talking with Buddhist monks, and the whole range of interesting aspects for my PhD. By coincidence, the early years of the 1980s when I was in Thailand was the period when the first commercially successful gay magazines were being published in Thailand at that point in time. So I found myself doing my Buddhist philosophy PhD during the day and buying and reading these fascinating local magazines in the evenings back in my room in my residence. I found the narratives in these gay magazines from Bangkok in the early 1980s radically different from anything that I had known from Australia or Sydney for any of my readings of history of sexuality or gay studies or lesbian studies in the West, such as it was at that time in Britain or North America. And I began translating some of these narratives in these magazines with the idea of trying to represent their distinctiveness, the different ideas of sexuality and gender identity, what they're emerging in these publications. And when I came back to Canberra to begin to write up my PhD on Thai Buddhism, I showed some of my colleagues in Thai studies at ANU my early work on these translations and the narratives I was trying to create through these ideas of sexual identity that I was finding in these translations. Many of my colleagues at the ANU were anthropologists who were extremely critical of the narratives I was trying to construct in these translations. In the 1970s in Australia, I had never heard of the word Eurocentrism. All I'd heard of was anti-imperialism. In the early 1980s, Eurocentrism and Eurocentrism became frames within which could think about critiquing Western frames of knowledge. And it was my peers, my colleagues in anthropology, who said I could really only begin to interpret these Thai discourses of gay identity, gay sexuality, through a lens that would engage issues of cultural identity. And in the early 1980s, the only Western discourses that were really engaging issues of gender or sexuality in Asia was anthropology. So I found myself reading anthropology in order to provide a frame. I managed to finish the PhD in Thai Buddhist philosophy on modern ideas of transformations of Buddhist philosophy. But realistically, in the mid-1980s, being stuck in Australia, I really didn't see any future. There were no positions in Buddhist philosophy that I could think of. So I had to think, where was I going to structure an academic career to take myself forward? I still could not think that gay studies was going to be any future. There was really no possibility of that, I thought, at that point in time in Australia. But in Thailand, I'd realized that this institution, this philosophy, this religion was much, much more than simply a Buddhist way of life, a Buddhist sense of attainment, of enlightenment. But actually, it functioned in Thailand historically as a form of political ideology. Buddhism was much more than a religion. It had functioned as a way for structuring the state. And in thinking about where to take my research forward, I applied for and luckily got a postdoc at ISIS in Singapore on the edge of the NUS campus there, not far from ARI. And I did a postdoc on how Buddhism had become historically a political ideology in Thailand in the state's reformation from absolute monarchy through to dictatorship and various forms of semi-democracy through the 20th century. And it was really that research on Buddhism as a political ideology that enabled me to get a teaching position, finally, a research position at the ANU in Canberra in history, in Southeast Asian history. And that was what my primary research was on at that point in time. By the time I got this job in the early 1990s, it was the time when queer studies, when Foucauldian critiques of identity, Foucauldian critiques of notions of sexuality as a discursive form were forming and beginning to form an increasingly important radical frame for studies of gender and sexuality. So I was able to I continued and reformulated my research on gender and sexuality in Thailand through this more critical queer frame. But coming back to the issue of disciplinary frames, I had got my job in Canberra on the basis of my research on Buddhism as a political ideology. And it was only on the basis of my research on Buddhism and politics and Thai history that I was able to, in a sense, maintain a position, because of all of the performance criteria, because of all of the promotion criteria for getting a position, were wholly on the basis of my research on Buddhism. So my research on sexuality, on gay identities in Thailand, was really an academic side effect. It was really something I was able to do in my spare time continue to publish on. But in a sense, given the disciplinary formation in which I found myself, it really didn't count anything for having an academic career. Even though I found myself having an increasing influence, an increasing role internationally in colleagues and discussions on issues of sexuality and identity. By the late 1990s, I had a number of colleagues in Australia also working on other Asian countries, working on issues of sexuality and gender in Taiwan, in Singapore, in Japan, and other countries. We collaborated in going to a range of conferences. We gave presentations both to Asian area studies conferences in Australia and internationally, and also to the beginnings of queer studies conferences happening internationally. But we found collectively that our research on Asian queer identities, Asian queer cultures, was marginalized both within area studies conferences and also within the emerging framework queer studies. When we presented on Asian queer studies in the area studies conferences, it was really, in a sense, beyond the pale of the thinly structured area studies formations, which were very, very non-radical, which were very empirical, and quite conservative, really resisting, in a sense, studying challenging issues of sexuality and gender. Even though in the late 90s and early 2000s, there were queer studies conferences internationally, these were amazingly Eurocentric. It was European American queer studies, queer theory, queer analysis, queer history that was being framed. And in a sense, Asia was, in a sense, totally peripheral to this. So in a sense, we then realized, those of us working on Asian queer cultures, that was only if we organized ourselves, we did our own organizing, that we had any hope of moving this field forward. So coming back in Australia, we had organized a range of networks under the banner of Asia Pacific Queer in the first few years of the 2000s. We took this offshore to Singapore, to various other places with panels, international conferences, to begin to move these issues forward. By the early 2000s, I found that the intellectual framework of Asian area studies in Australia had shifted, where I could begin to think of having a career focusing primarily on sexuality studies rather than Buddhist studies. And I was able to move from, in a sense, an academic career based on studies of history of religion to a career that could, in a sense, engage issues of sexual identity up front rather than simply as a sideline. And working with other colleagues at the ANU, particularly around the early 2010s, who were working in Asian and Pacific area studies, who were finding their work, whether they were in anthropology, whether they were in history, what other departments they were working in, their research on issues of gender sexuality, issues on national identity in the Pacific or in parts of Asia, they were finding the disciplinary formations that they were working within too restrictive, in a sense, to allow them to take this forward. And so a group of us in the ANU, in the Research School of Pacific and Asian Studies, in a sense, defected from our old departments of history, our old departments of anthropology, and we reformed into a new department of gender and cultural studies that, in a sense, provide a frame to begin to be more supportive of these more cross-disciplinary projects on topics on gender identity, on sexual identity, national identity, on issues, in a sense, we're taking research forward into new proto-disciplinary, into new emerging disciplinary formations that could, in a sense, study identity beyond the narrow frames of the existing disciplines, which are often too restrictive in their notions of methodology, not giving, in a sense, enough space to take the issue of identity forward in the new, in a sense, a multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary framework. In a sense, that was the frame that that I sort of moved towards, and in which I'm continuing to begin to work within. But just come back to the point I made at the beginning, in a sense, coming back to the broader frames. Yes, it's one thing to try to find a satisfactory disciplinary formation within which identity can be studied, theorized, analyzed, considered in a way that does justice to the full diversity of what the formation of identity is, both critically and empirically in its very various dimensions. So in a sense, finding an academic frame to take this field forward has been a really difficult issue. At the same time, in trying to develop, in a sense, cross-disciplinary formations to look at identity, all of us, I think, globally have been subject to, in a sense, an audit culture, to a sense of monitoring about academic performance, whether research outputs, how to give numbers to the books, the research, the academic grants, research grants that one is receiving globally, and also performance indicators, global rankings of universities. All of this audit culture that universities globally are subject to, I think in a sense is reinforcing, is reinstitutionalizing the existing academic boundaries that are making it increasingly hard or sometimes difficult to build cross-disciplinary formations. Why do I say this? It's because that in order to measure in audit culture, to give a number to one's academic outputs, one's articles, one's books, one's research grants, etc., one is assigned to give a number to a disciplinary formation. Is your article history? Is your book Buddhist studies? Is your research grant in anthropology? What is the disciplinary formation that the departments of education, that whoever is monitoring these things, give numbers to? What is the formation that you assign yourself to in order for us to be able to measure you? And I can see that scholars, particularly younger scholars who are very concerned to be able to justifiably to get tenure, to get grants, to get research recognized, need to fit, in a sense, to play the game of fitting their research into these categories, which are easy to measure. But at the same time, the topic of identity moves beyond, it oozes outside. It doesn't fit within these easily disciplinary formations that are subject to measurement. So I think at the moment, just to finish off, I think at this point in time, while the issues of identity remain forefront and important and crucial to take forward in new and interesting ways, and we have to keep thinking about ways to build formation within university structures to allow this research to happen, so that innovative methodologies, innovative theories can be nurtured to think beyond existing boundaries, to, in a sense, deal with the complexity of the world as it is in the 21st century. That remains important. And at the same time, we have pressures from outside of us, from academic monitors, to keep putting ourselves inside boxes, keep putting ourselves inside limited frames of disciplinary knowledge. So I don't have any easy answer to that, but maybe in the discussion we can talk about this. So I think, to conclude, in terms of my own movement through a whole range of theoretical monitors, that different, through an emergence of different theories, different situations politically, the last 40 years that I've moved from academically, I think that we at this point in time are working within a frame to try to think beyond boundaries intellectually, to deal with the issues of identity. At the same time, we are fighting against forms of resistances outside of us, which are continually trying to put us inside boxes, that in a sense limit the type of cross-disciplinary dialogues that I think are important in order to take this discussion forward. So thank you. I'll leave it at that for the moment.
And our final speaker, Prof. Ong, please. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this roundtable, and indeed to give us an opportunity to bring our scholarship together with our personal journeys. So as a student in the 1970s, I was told in no uncertain terms that there was no place for the subjectivity of the researcher in scholarly research. The word I was completely banned from scholarly discourse. Now, these days, however, the identity of the researcher is increasingly recognized as an important aspect of what motivates and guides scholarly work, or even as an important topic in its own right. The mainstreaming of identity-focused or identity-driven research is strongly related to the rise of what in the West, in any case, has been called identity politics. It began with the rise of feminism in the 1970s, which had popularized the slogan, "The personal is political." This led to the massive surge of what we now call gender studies, which focused not just on the dispassionate study of the construction of gender identities, but validated the conduct of that scholarship from a politicized, gendered perspective. This meant taking the unequal power relations between men and women as a starting point for the research, as well as the objective to critique and dismantle those power relations. Now, most people working in this field were and are women, and generally their identities as women are an important motivating factor for them to do this research. We could also say that their gendered perspective, informed by personal experience as a woman, can contribute strongly to the development of new insights, of new lenses on how culture and society operate, which were previously overlooked or simply not deemed significant. The same can be said about a lot of race and ethnic studies. In the past 30 or 40 years, it has been mostly non-white scholars who have advanced our understanding of the operation of race and white hegemony in Western societies mostly, but also globally. In general, such work has highlighted the implicit and explicit racialized discrimination in the very structures of modern society, a racism that is often part of the embodied experience of the scholars concerned. Now, in my own case, the entanglement of identity and scholarship became inescapable when I had to face up to the implications of my own ethnicity in the context of Asia. I was born in Indonesia, but migrated to the Netherlands with my family when I was 12. I became a media and cultural studies scholar at the University of Amsterdam before relocating to Australia for a job in the early 1990s. The interesting thing about Australia to me was, at that time, its proximity to Asia. In fact, I have often said when asked why I decided to come to Australia, that it was because it was close to Indonesia, the country of my birth. My own experience as a child in a Peranakan Chinese family in Indonesia has been formative for my intellectual perspective on identity. In particular, it has shaped my understanding of the complexities of Chineseness or Chinese identity. It was because we were recognized as Chinese in Indonesia that I first experienced racism, which resulted, to me at least, in a troubled relationship with Chineseness. I felt it was an imposed, unchosen identity, which was associated with us being an unwanted minority subject. In some ways, the racism I experienced in Indonesia was more painful and more violent than in Europe, where a pluralist liberal milieu made it possible that I could mostly forget about my own nominal Chineseness. At the same time, as I discovered many years later, this Chineseness is also a very contested and contestable label of identification. I had to face up to this when I went to a conference in a majority Chinese country for the first time, Taiwan, in 1992, which led to my writing of the essay on not speaking Chinese, later published in the book of that title. This essay is still quoted regularly by other scholars, particularly where I put forward the idea that Chineseness is a flexible and indeterminate signifier whose meanings are not fixed and given, but constantly renegotiated and rearticulated, especially in diasporic contexts. This emphasis on the constructed, hybridized nature of Chineseness as an identity category seemed to have resonated strongly. It has certainly influenced a lot of younger diasporic Chinese scholars. To me personally, writing this essay was liberating because it enabled me to put my own autobiography in a broader historical and cultural context. It also clarified to me how Indonesianized Chineseness was quite disconnected from the dominant versions of Chineseness circulating in Greater China, the People's Republic of China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and to a certain extent, Singapore. This points to something that remains a sensitive issue in Southeast Asia, the place of Chinese identified minorities in many Southeast Asian national contexts. In my own case, I have wondered whether it made sense for me to claim a Chinese identity at all, given that I have never been inducted in a Chinese cultural environment, especially not the Chinese language, which is, of course, the background of the title of my essay on not speaking Chinese. In other words, although I am of Chinese descent, I would argue, as I have written in a later essay, that I am only residually Chinese, or perhaps even no longer Chinese. Speaking about Southeast Asia, the exceptional context of Singapore, where the Chinese are the dominant majority ethnic group outside China, is of course a fascinating one. As we know, the Singapore government has been at pains to strengthen the Chineseness of Chinese Singaporeans through, for example, the Speak Mandarin campaign. This is a form of state-driven identity politics we can discuss. And I know that quite a lot of people, scholars in Singapore, have really worked on this very seriously. Today, this issue of Chineseness has become even more complex and problematic as a result of the increasingly assertive role of the People's Republic of China, as well as the influx of many mainland Chinese migrants across the region, which has heightened really the contested nature of Chinese identity. One of the central problems here is related to the racialization of the Chinese, which homogenizes all people of Chinese descent as belonging to a single race, right? Despite their huge diversity and dispersal across many different parts of the world. My own work on Chineseness from or not speaking Chinese onwards has been an effort to critique this determinist, essentializing understanding of Chineseness as the racial identity. What I find quite surprising, however, is that this critical effort has been a tough one to communicate. Often, ordinary diasporic Chinese tend to implicitly embrace the racialization of Chineseness. For example, when they identify themselves as Chinese by referring to their Chinese blood or to their Chinese face. Such racialized claims to Chineseness need to be interrogated, in my view, just as the very notion of identity itself should be interrogated rather than uncritically affirmed. This, at least, is what I think is our role as identity scholars. And it becomes even more important, in my view, because identities have become so much more prominent, really, in political struggles as something that people embrace and want to celebrate. And it is understandable that minority groups are keen to celebrate their identities, as it is a way of expressing their resistance and resilience vis-a-vis hegemonic power relations, and to mark their rights and presence on the social, cultural, and political stage. But this is my view. As scholars, we really need to go beyond identity. We need to resist treating identity as a given, as the naturalized focal point for sentiment, loyalty, or belonging, whether as a race, a gender, a nation, or an ethnicity. Instead, it is important to see identity as always socially constructed and often in complex political contexts. In this sense, to return to the topic of Chineseness, it is important to ask, for example, who should count as Chinese in the first place? And even more importantly, who decides? It is interesting to note, for example, that many Taiwanese today refuse to identify themselves as Chinese for reasons we know. In this way, they strategically break the idea of the Chinese as a single race. And it is this kind of deconstructive turn that my own work on Chineseness has tried to articulate, in line with my personal experience as someone whose Chinese identity was always in doubt and contested in the first place. So in a way, I think I haven't got a kind of a sense of the stakes of identity, or the paradigms of identity research changing so much. Instead, I would suggest that it has become even more important these days to conduct that deconstructive turn that I have tried to explain here using my own experience and trajectory as an example. Thank you. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you to all our three panelists, again, for very enlightening conversations. Before I dismiss you and we go, one final program note that I've been asked to announce that the next ARI20 roundtable series will be held a week from today at 6 p.m. Singapore time, entitled Migration Futures and Transnational Scholarship, Pandemic Times, Uncertain Mobilities, and the End of the Age of Migration. It has a question mark in the end. I don't think I read it correctly. That's a long thing. It's a long phrase to have it, but it's a question mark. Anyway, for some of you, have a good rest of the day. For others, have a good evening. Again, thank you very much on behalf of ARI. Thank you for ARI staff for all the behind the scenes work for putting this on. It seemed to have gone very smoothly. I hope everyone enjoyed a great deal today. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.